So this afternoon, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Robin Dunbar, who's going to give our seminar. He is Professor of Evolutionary Psychology in the Department of Experimental Psychology in Oxford. He has a first degree from Oxford in Psychology and Philosophy, followed by a PhD in Psychology from Bristol University. And subsequent to that, he's had numerous academic posts, awards, and publications. His research is concerned with understanding the mechanisms that underpin social bonding, and he's developed the social brain hypothesis. He's been long interested in social evolution and considering the question of why is there religion and what does it do? And it's a privilege to introduce him this afternoon. He's going to speak to us on the title of Religion, Evolution, and the Social Brain. Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're further east, or maybe good evening if you're, further west, or good evening if you're further east. So I'll just bring my slides up, if I can, on screen share. So I'm really, I suppose, going to try and argue a case for religion as having evolved as an important element in the toolkit that we've developed over the course of time for bonding social communities. Well, it would now, okay. So in a sense, it seems to me what we have to explain here is in some ways the general view that has held for probably well over a century, probably closer to a century and a half, that early religions were of a largely shamanic kind, really centered around trance, what I tend to call immersive religions, because the individuals are, if you like, the religion, the community of the religion, rather than having a separated priesthood. And how that evolved eventually at some point into the kind of modern world religions or doctrinal religions that we have. And the key to this, I think, in my view anyway, is that buried well beneath almost all the doctrinal religions are still a very, very strong trance-based phenomenon that forms an important part of the process of religious belief. And so I'm kind of viewing religious belief here as an emotional commitment, not some kind of intellectual commitment. So centrally, I'm going to make 4 points, I think. The first is that the central function of religion has been community bonding. The second, that there has been this shift from shamanic to doctrinal religions, and that this shift was really the result of strains and stresses created by demography, particularly increasing community size. Third, that the doctrinal religions have not replaced the shamanic religions, but are really a crete on top of it. So the shamanic, the original, if you like, form of religion is still very much in evidence. And that if we understand that, this might explain a lot of the, I won't say peculiarities, but features of the contemporary religious scene. So just to sort of set the scene here, this is really sprung off the so-called social brain hypothesis, the argument that monkeys and apes in particular, primates generally, evolved unusually large brains to cope with unusually large and complex social systems that they have. And here is essentially the original evidence put for it, which is a plot of average social group size for different species. So each of these dots here is one species, plotted against some measure of brain size. And here's the original measure I used, which is the neocortex ratio, which is the proportion essentially of the brain that's devoted to neocortex as opposed to the kind of archaic subcortical units that have been there since the rise of the vertebrates, really. So it's just a measure of the relative investment in high-level cognitive functions as opposed to those kind of functions that keep the body and soul together in one piece and maintain the somatic processes. what has transpired over time is that actually this generic relationship, which reduces correlation between group size and brain size, actually consists of a number of separate grades that are built there inside it. And these become very clear once you appreciate what's going on. There are in fact 4 grades. I only show 3 of them here. The 2 on the left are essentially composed of monkeys primarily, essentially smart monkeys here and less smart monkeys there, and then over to the right, the apes. Now, if we want to know what size group humans fit into this scheme, then it's simply a matter of plugging in human neocortex ratio, which is just a tad over 4 here, and that's from the same brain database. And if we plug that in, we get a figure of, to the ape line, we get a figure of about 150, which is now what's now known as Dunbar's number. And there is now huge amount of evidence for the existence of this number, which comes from the size of personal social networks, analyses of national telephone databases, analyses of Facebook data, which again, obviously have a huge pool, and some interesting historical areas such as, or data sets such as the size of villages in the Doomsday Book, according to the estimates of historians. They average almost exactly 150 in every single county in England. And indeed, the size of English villages in the 1770s, as estimated by the historical demographers from parish registers of births and deaths, and they've reconstructed the size of units. Average county size is, village size in almost every county is again about 150. And last but not least, contemporary hunter-gatherer community sizes. So this is a very robust number. It appears all over the place. Just to put that into its evolutionary historical context, we can estimate the equivalent values for all our ancestral species in the entire hominin lineage, going back to the earliest members, the Australopithecines down here, and before them, the common ancestor with the African great apes. And this is simply a matter of interpolating through a series of equations from cranial volume size, of which we have a lot of, to what it predicts for community size. So the black bars here are the average for that particular species. The gray areas are the 25 to 75% percentile ranges. And the point here is simply to notice that here's the Australopithecines down here. Since this graph was drawn, paleontologists have now decided to swap these 2 round and think that Homo habilis, as they were always known, is in fact a late Australopithecine, and Australopithecus rudolfensis here is in fact an early Homo, which makes the graph look even better. But the point here is that there's very little variation in community size right the way across 2+ million years of Australopithecine evolution. In fact, this is bang on where chimpanzees sit. So they really are just bipedal great apes. And then suddenly, with the appearance of earliest Homo, sometime around 2.5 million years ago, group size takes off, rising to around 150 with the appearance of our own species. So all these data here for anatomically modern humans, as this is down there, are in fact fossil populations. They're not modern populations, but here's the value that we predict for modern humans and we get for modern humans, and you can see that our fossil populations of our own species are bang on target, as it were, where they should be. So it's that scale really of increasing group size that I'm going to argue has put strain on the mechanisms used by all primates down in this area here for social bonding. But just let me add a few bits of data that are relevant to the size of religious communities in the contemporary world. The top right here is a set of data that was originally put together by Rich Sosis, in fact, on the sizes of American utopian communities in the 19th century. So the light grey bars here are religious communities, and the dark grey bars are, if I have them the right way around, are secular communities, Owenite type secular communities. And these are people that separated themselves off from the world, were self-sustaining in terms of agriculture and so on. Include people like the Shakers and the Onedins and all sorts of mysterious and wonderful sects and cults, most of which have long since disappeared. But I just draw your attention to the fact that there's this bimodal distribution, and the bimodal distribution really predominantly actually reflects the difference. So this is the size at foundation when they were founded, difference between secular communities and religious ones. And the important issue here, I think, is if you look at the survival, how long these communities actually survived before they disbanded, and plot them against the size at foundation, what you find is really a very clear separation in which the secular communities sit in here with an optimal size at foundation of about 65, whereas and a longevity of about something in the order of 15 years, maximum longevity in the order of 15 years, whereas the religious communities have an optimal size at foundation, let's say ones that survive longest, of about 170, and a longevity that's much closer to about 120 years or so. So I just draw your attention really to the striking difference between these two. The fact that actually this is roughly your 150 number here, and this is the inner layer that fits within that, which nominally is at about 50, but I'm not going to go into that in particular here. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there's something about religious foundations which allow them to be bigger and to cope better with the stresses of a bigger community without falling apart, and as a result to survive longer. This is also reflected actually in the Israeli kibbutzim, most of whom, of course, are secular foundations, but there are a number that have a specific religious philosophy. And the difference between them in terms of, this is detrended size, so this is taking into account the fact that the various kibbutzim have lasted for different lengths of it. All the ones that have been founded actually have all survived, but some of them are recent foundations and others go back to the 1920s. If you remove that effect and look at their basal size, then the secular ones are around about here at about 150, and the religious ones seem to be able to cope with a much bigger group size. And just one other observation on the Hutterites from the American mid-north Dakotas primarily. If you look at now the interesting thing about Hutterites is, of course, they're a fundamentalist Christian community. Everything is done on a democratic basis. All decisions are made by the community as a community. It's all based on farming. But periodically they split the community when they feel it's got too large, and a new daughter community is set up on its own farm. And if you look at the intervals between successive fissions, and these are based on about 100 fissions in 2 lineages, community lineages over the last century roughly. What's striking about this is that although inevitably there's a lot down here, nonetheless, a very distinct and statistically significant U-shaped curve here with these horns suggesting that communities that aimed at foundation sizes around about 150 or 50 survived much longer before they needed to fission again than ones that are in the middle. There seems to be something kind of magical about these numbers that allows the community to work better together. And indeed, the Hutterites specifically aim at a community size of about 150 as their limit. All fissions occur on average when the community is about 165 to 170 in size. So this figure of 150 kind of keeps reappearing in all sorts of interesting contexts, some of which are religious. And indeed, it's worth pointing out that there's a very long and eminent tradition in congregation, church congregation size and church plantings, which essentially has come up with the same argument. It's pointed to a figure of somewhere below 200 as the optimal limit for maintaining community bonding within a congregation, and a particular congregation that's spun off or based on a single minister or priest. So the question then is really, well, how do we maintain these groups? Well, we do it in the same time-honored tradition that all monkeys and apes do. It's a two-process mechanism built around this kind of stuff here, social grooming, to which they devote an inordinate amount of time. The two components of this which work in tandem are an intensely emotional component, which is derivative of grooming itself, and then a cognitive component built on top of that. And the cognitive component is really all about reciprocity and obligation and trust and these kind of things, even in monkeys and apes. And in part, those relationships of obligation, reciprocity come off the opportunity to interact in these kind of intensely social ways through grooming. And what grooming does is trigger the endorphin system in the brain, the stroking of the hair or the fur that goes on when they're grooming each other, triggers the endorphin system in the brain. The brain, the endorphins are an opiate or an opioid, technically, so they have the same effects as an opiate. They make you very relaxed and trusting and contented and happy with whatever's going on, and particularly with those who doing whatever these activities are with. And we've looked at the underpinnings of this in humans. We know it's an endorphin system is the important thing in primates. We've repeated those kind of studies with humans with PET scanning, which is fairly unpleasant for those submitting to it. But the point is that if you have, so we have a subject here being put in the scanner, and while the partner is very likely stroking their abdomen and chest, torso, if you like. And what these data show very nicely is the brain just firing up all over the place with endorphin. So these are the endorphin receptor sites all over the brain, except for the visual system at the back, which is not too surprising, but certainly up in the major area of the cortex, and particularly the frontal cortex up here. It's just absorbing endorphins like fury and creating this sense of contentedness and trust and bondedness. So this is the mechanism at work. This physical touch-based mechanism really is incredibly expensive in time. So if you look at what happens in primates, if you plot the proportion of the day devoted to grooming against the size of the group, it basically increases, but then hits a limit at around 20%. So these species up here, these very intensely social species, are devoting a fifth of their entire day to this activity, which is a huge burden, but necessary in order to keep these relatively larger groups together up in this end. The rest of it, of course, is the rest of the day you need for resting and or foraging, and that really imposes a limit. Now, the question we might ask in this context is, well, how much grooming would we have to do if we bonded our groups, our communities of 150 in exactly the same way? So just plug that in and plug it into the notional linear relationship, ignoring the fact that there's this asymptotic flattening here constrained by the structure of time. But if time was free, how much time would we have to devote to grooming? The answer is something like 43% of the day would have to be devoted to this activity. And there's no way any primate never mind a human could afford to do that. So the question is, what do we do? It creates a big gap in there, in effect. Well, a series of samples we've managed to locate some years ago on the actual amount of time that people devote to interactions in 7 different societies from all around the world suggested that actually we only devote about 20% on average of our day to social interaction, excluding work context, but actual real social interaction. So somehow we managed to bridge this enormous gap here in order to use time more effectively. And it raises the question of how we've done that. And what we think has happened is the following. So this is a plot of time required for grooming as a function of the community sizes for the different species for all our ancestral species. So these are individual populations. These are Australopithecines down here, Homo erectus up here. These are the Homo habilis that I mentioned earlier, archaic humans, the Heidelberg folk and the Neanderthals, some of the bigger Neanderthals poking away up there. And here's fossil anatomically modern humans in here, and the 43% line there for modern humans. So it's that gap that somehow we've tried to solve. And what we think has happened is these sets of activities have come in turn. And probably at these particular junctures, these points of uplift, as it were. So there's stable here, there's an uplift to a new level, it's fairly stable, it's an uplift to a new level again. So we think this is almost certainly the earliest, simply because we share it with great apes. We and they share laughter. Singing and dancing probably came in later because we don't need language for either of these. They work without language very well. Then finally, language kicks in with anatomically modern humans around about 200,000 years ago. And we get things like religion and storytelling as additional mechanisms for social bonding. All of them, in fact, turn out to trigger the endorphin system. I'll just show you one set of data. We've done laughter in PET scanning machines, and here's a composite picture of our subject's brains going wild with endorphins after a good laughter session. You can see again the back end here, the visual system and the cerebellum down here is unaffected, but the main block of the neocortex, and in particular the frontal lobes up here, are just going wild. Okay. So that's the sort of framework, if you like. That's what we have to try and explain. As part of this, attempting to explore this, I ran a survey looking at people's sense of belonging and their sense of contentedness and happiness with their life and so on, as a function of how religious they were. So this is one of those bits of data just to illustrate and make the point that, if you like, attendance at religious activities is good for you in some particular respect. In this particular respect is how bonded you feel to the actual congregation. So this is a measure of how bonded people feel specifically to the congregation members that they regularly attend with, as a function of how often they attend. So this is something in the order of daily, this is something in the order of yearly down here, and this is not at all. And you can see that, oh no, this can't be not at all, because it's all people who are active attenders at religious services at least sometimes. So this will be yearly down here. And you can see that the sense of belonging increases dramatically with frequency of attendance. It's partly a function of familiarity, of course. The question is really whether that is also created by the rituals involved in religion, because after all, among the many rituals of religion are things like singing and storytelling, particularly emotionally charged storytelling, all of which we know trigger the endorphin system. My collaborators at Coventry have been running a series of studies. They did here in the UK 13 Christian churches, mostly at the sort of Church of England and other Protestant churches, but also some Catholic ones. And then they ran a comparable series of studies on 11 Umbanda church services in Brazil. Umbanda is one of these Afro-Caribbean, Brazilian churches that sprung up in the 1920s, I think, in southern Brazil, and is still quite active there. It's a sort of a peculiar mix match of Catholic theology and West African traditional religion, particularly Yoruba traditional religions. The services are essentially trance-based, so these are the people who are going to take part. They're the trance masters, if you like, and they will, once the service gets going, they will take part in the dancing that produces trance states, and the rest of the congregation sits around. And it's kind of has very much a Pentecostal sort of feel to it. And then they did 4 comparable studies on Sunday assembly meetings, and Sunday assembly is, if you've come across it before, is this relatively new phenomenon whereby people meet on a Sunday to do all the kinds of things that you would normally see at a Anglican, in particular, church service on a Sunday morning, but it has no religious context. Its theology is atheism, if you like, but it's the same rituals to try, and it was designed to try and recapture that sense of the community at meetings. And then in addition, they ran some studies on yoga classes where the same yoga instructor, professional yoga instructor, ran yoga classes which were either completely secular in philosophy or, if you like, the, in quotes, religious theory of the yoga practices were explained to explain what was going on. So complex a range of subjects or studies that were done. And I'll just show you a couple of key results out of this. This is this same index of bonding. How bonded do you feel to the community before the Sunday ritual and after the Sunday ritual? These are the averages for the various churches in England. This is the 4 Sunday assembly groups. You can, 2 interesting things here. Both of them, there's an increase in a sense of belonging to the community, of being bonded to a community. But at the same time, the churches start at a higher level and end at a higher level. So the effect is much stronger there. And then what they did was one of our standard practices to ascertain whether this is really being driven, this increase here is being driven by endorphins triggered by the activities involved, which is in this case giving subjects an endorphin blocker, naltrexone, which locks into the endorphin receptor sites in the brain, but is pharmacologically neutral. So no matter what they do, they don't get the effect of the endorphins at all. And this was done both in the yoga groups and the selection of Umbanda services in Brazil. And here are the sense of bonding for those in the placebo groups who just had a sugar pill, as it were. And you can see the same nice increases you have here from before to after. But in both cases, those who had the naltrexone felt much less bonded to the members of the community than they had before. And that's a classic pattern that you see with these naltrexone experiments, that people who are getting no kick lose a sense of community, as it were, over time. All right, so if you like, this is a kind of explanation for how early religions in that early trance-based phase might have arisen as a mechanism, as part of the toolkit for social bonding. But it seems to me that something that's been, in some senses, completely overlooked is the Neolithic. We tend to see the Neolithic as something to do with agriculture and the invention of agriculture. But actually, that's not what the real problem is. In fact, agriculture began before the people started settling in villages. in the Neolithic by about 1,000 years now, the archaeologists maintain. And at the end of the day, agriculture is not that complicated. In fact, the causal logic seems to have been reversed in our classic understanding of this, which says people, one of the outcomes of the Neolithic was the invention of agriculture. And the answer is, in some sense, that is true, but it's actually the other way around. They had to invent agriculture to live in settlements, because otherwise they simply wouldn't have been able to sustain themselves. Now, the problem is that all social living in all primates, indeed all mammals, it introduces stresses on the members of the community, which are extremely destabilizing. And normally, in the case of the less smart, less socially and cognitively highly evolved primates, and indeed mammals in general, these stresses limit social group sizes to around 15 individuals. You really can't get more than 15 to 20 individuals together in a stable group. If you're going to have stable groups bigger than that, and especially if you're going to have stable groups of the size that very quickly they went to during the Neolithic in some of these places in the Levant, you've got to have mechanisms to prevent these dispersive forces just driving the community apart. And my suggestion is that's exactly what the doctrinal religions did. That's why the shift from these kind of immersive, largely trance-based religions into religions which now had formal priesthoods and reserved various functions and activities to that class of individuals that were based on symbolism, absolutely crucial. Just bearing in mind that most of these traditional small-scale hunter-gatherer trance-type shamanic religions don't really have any concept of gods. In fact, some of them don't have gods in there at all. And the moral codes are completely separate. Now, in the post-Neolithic period, you have the moral code locked into the theology, as it were. Just to give you a sense of how this might work, here's a particular archaeological example which has worked through this quite nicely. This has involved one of the early pre-Inca states in Bolivia, on Lake Titicaca. Here's the bottom corner of Lake Titicaca, and the archaeologists focused on this peninsula here. Round about the sort of 1500 to 1000 BC period when they first pick it up, this is horticulturalist. There's typical, they estimate village sizes of about 150. They knew nothing about Dunbar's number when they did all this, I should hasten to add. They estimate that fissions were occurring in villages of about 170. This is what the archaeology record tells you. And then this was quite stable for a very long time. Then there was a period in which suddenly villages started to increase in size. They were fissioning at around 270 to 300 in size. And then shortly after that, the Tiwanaku state emerges and kicks in and becomes a kind of political unit. Settlements now get very large. They're all bigger than about 400 individuals. You have this Yayamama religion complex emerging as identified by particular ritual structures and particular things like incense burners and ceramic trumpets, which appear to have no sort of everyday function, and stone sculptures and all these kind of things. So you have a shift here during a relatively short period of time from one state to another, a real phase transition, which the system just completely flips and remains stable only because you have this, what's effectively a top-down control of what's going on. And you can see this switch really in some of the small-scale tribal data here. This is a plot of the size of the population, or the group community size, against the size of their communal structures. And when the community size is small, you have very small structures. They're often generalized domestic and ritual structures, often indistinguishable. And then suddenly when you go through a barrier to around about 250, community about 250, you get into a different ball game where you have specialized ritual structures that are designed for religious, specifically for religious activities. So just to sort of move the thing to what I think is the last phase, this point you now have generic doctrinal religions in place with very specific rituals, but there's one more phase that has long been known about, and of course that's the axial age, when you have the major modern religions emerging in this kind of triangle here. And I just want to offer you an explanation for why this might have happened, because I actually don't think there is one. Well, several people have recently taken a great interest in this and have offered explanations, but I don't think they're explanations in the proper functional sense. They're relevant and important. We'll come to that. The issue really needs me just to explain something. We're getting into climate change here. So it interdigitates very well with some of the other lectures that are coming up on climate change. But let me just draw your attention to an interesting feature of the world's biogeography. So if you look at the world, obviously, is the equator in the middle here, and the tropics either side of that, which define this kind of area of relatively high temperature and luxuriant growth. So most of the tropical forests, the big forests, the Amazonian forest here, the West African forest here, and the South Asian forest down here in Borneo and the Philippines and so on. With increasingly arid, essentially, conditions as you go further and further north until you get into the Arctic and Antarctic circles, where you're in what's effectively a desert. There's long been recognized that outside the tropics, there lies a quite narrow zone. It's only 12 degrees of latitude, a couple of hundred miles in depth, where there's a transitional zone which is relatively non-seasonal. So the important thing about this is you have quite a non-seasonal environment here with pretty much growing conditions that are getting on for 12 months long, particularly over in the west side here, the monsoon issues around the Indian Ocean. But in general, you're dealing with a climate which is very good for growing stuff. And up here, a climate which is not good for growing stuff because it's very seasonal. And then in between is this sort of intermediate area, the subtropical zone. Well, let me just point out to you where all, it seems, of the major religions have had their origins. So we're over here with Shinto, the major philosophies, Confucianism and so on, Hinduism, Buddhism over here in India, Zoroastrianism, and various other elements here. Of course, the Abrahamic religions here in the Levant, Pharaonic, the early Pharaonic religions here. And then some interesting obscure things which are all monogamous. Sorry, not monogamous, I mean monotheistic. The Oromo, who've moved down into their present position in Ethiopia, down here from up here historically. The Igbo, who now occupy this part of Nigeria down here and have moved down historically. The Himba, who are Bantu, who've moved down from here into this area, have been here for around 400 years. Over here, we've got the Incas and the Aztecs just sitting on the edges of these days. But I just draw your attention to the extraordinary pattern where almost all these major religions, particularly the monotheistic ones, lie within or have their origins within the northern subtropical zone. Of course, the southern subtropical zone has relatively little landmass in it other than in Australia. So what's peculiar about the subtropical zone? Well, I should just point out the two bits of evidence that have been adduced in this respect, one by Harvey Whitehouse and Peter Turchin, looking at the evolution of social complexity as a function of kind of generic doctrinal rituals and the appearance of moralizing high gods taken as the marker of these kind of religions, such as you have in the Abrahamic religions. And they benchmarked that to the appearance of, over time, of moralizing high gods, and looked at the levels of social complexity indexed by various different phenomena before that and after that. And you can see at this point here, a couple of thousand years prior to the appearance of moralizing high gods, it's fairly stable, and it suddenly starts to take off. Moralizing high gods come into play, and everything stabilizes. And again, this is a comparable kind of analysis by Nicholas Baumard, and they looked at essentially production in relation to the appearance of the axial age. So here's the axial age arriving here around about 500 BC. So I only get 0 here marks BC, not today. Sorry, 0 AD, not 2020. 500 AD, BC rather, being the sort of marker for the central part of the axial age. And they point out that particularly in the main area, that's to say in Asia essentially, East and West Asia, the dramatic rise in the productivity and indeed the sizes of houses and so on, other indices they use, suggesting that population is becoming richer. They develop an argument for that. Now, I suggest that actually both of these are properly explained. These are outcomes. These are not drivers. These are better understood as outcomes. The real driver for both cases is just population increase. And they point out that this shift often occurs somewhere about a state size of about 1 million people. Suddenly you've got a major problem. Now, why should that happen in the subtropical zone? Well, here's what I think the answer is. We see that area, particularly in Africa now, as predominantly desert. That's the Sahara Desert occupying most of this subtropical zone on the African and Western Eurasia continent. But it's not always been like that. That's actually a very, very recent phenomenon. Between 10,000 BC at the end of the last ice age and 2000 BC, this subtropical zone was extremely rich and luxuriant. The Sahara here, northern Sahara up in this area here, which is now all sand and desert, had extensive lakes, very large rivers, hippos, crocodiles, fish, savanna antelope, baboons. And just to illustrate this is the current northern limit of the distribution of baboons now. And at the time we're talking about, prior to 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago, they were up here, this far north. So they've retreated by something the order of 850 miles as a result of increasing desertification during the decline of climate, as it were. So what's really explaining this, I think, is the fact that if you look at the disease burden that's born as a function of latitude, it's very, very high in the tropics and declines very rapidly once you're outside the tropics, and particularly outside the subtropical zone here. Whereas the growing season continues to be quite long until you're much further north. And it's the difference essentially between these two that makes the subtropics particularly rich in terms of population growth. And my suggestion is that the reason you had these big doctrinal religions arising in this region is this rapid development of large population sizes in large settlements, very large connotations. Okay, so it still leaves us really with the problem of mysticism, and I think the issue is that the doctrinal religions have not replaced the old trance-based religions. They've just been added on top, if you like. They're an accretion intended to impose essentially discipline. And this explains why all the big religions have a constant battle with fragmentation, cults welling up from underneath. There's a direct parallel here with language. There's something about these small scale groups of often 150, 200 in size, based around a charismatic leader, which are very intimate, very personal, and very difficult to control because they're based on, if you like, raw feels in the philosophical sense, the raw emotion of the experience of transcendence, as opposed to an intellectual cognitive persuasion. So just to wrap up, the central problem, I think, that we've always had as other monkey snakes has been community cohesion. Religion has emerged relatively late in our evolutionary history, or late in the whole period of 6 to 8 million years of human evolution, hominin evolution. Emerged probably with possibly the Neanderthals, but certainly with archaic humans. It evolved as a mechanism for bonding large communities. The doctrinal religions really arose in the Neolithic to make it possible for large communities, those same large communities, to live together in one place, basically without killing each other, which is otherwise what would happen. And then the kind of that last phase of super large religions, if you like, arising partly because of the growth in population size within that northern subtropical zone. And then finally, we have this extraordinary effect, which nobody's ever really, I think, had a good explanation for, is the fact that all the doctrinal religions have a constant battle with fragmentation, an attempt to create, if you like, theological uniformity. And this goes back to the rise of cults, I think, and a return to, or the fact that the original sense of small scale religion is still there and bubbling beneath the surface and very difficult to control. So that's the end of my talk. We can go back to the full screen, hopefully, and whatever that, oh, yes, okay, stop that sharing. Right.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that. Was a fascinating talk, and we are open for question and answer now. There are a few things that are appearing in the Q&A line. Do drop some more in as we go on. There's a few that have come in thinking about the current situation with the inability to meet physically, and what effects online Zoom type worship meetings are going to have. And do you see any long-term effect as well as short-term ones you predict?
Personally, I think the effects are largely going to be short-term. I think if there were enough of us old enough to have lived through the Spanish flu, we'd be saying exactly the same thing, and everything was all right after that within not very long. But they had the same problems and the same angst, and everybody was being sort of isolated and wearing face masks and all sorts of things as we're doing now. But the effects of that really didn't last very long. Zoom meetings and the like are useful, I think, just as they're useful for maintaining on everyday secular friendships, but they are, in our experience, sticking plasters. They're not going to prevent relationships deteriorating over time. And there's some evidence to suggest that when people have tried to hold larger scale, so after seminars, where normally there would be maybe in some cases a sort of buffet supper and drinks and so on, and people would circulate and chat, and that might go on for a very long time after a seminar. And they've tried doing that on the internet, and most of them have ended after about 15 minutes because it just doesn't work. I mean, it has more possible. It doesn't work as a personalized social environment, because you can't break off and go and have a chat with Jim in a corner. You're stuck with listening to lectures by the four people that shout loudest, probably. So if what you want is a kind of, I don't know, maybe a long hellfire and damnation sermon, that would work fine. And maybe some sort of charismatic uplifting, as it were, that would work fine as well. But I mean, for anything else, really, it's a sticking plaster. It just slows down the rate of decay. But it's the sooner everybody can get back to normality, the better.
Yes, and of course you can't sing together by Zoom. In fact, you can't even sing if you're meeting in person at the moment within church contexts.
That is true. Maybe you prefer to sing on your in Zoom context when other people can't hear you.
It's a question that actually takes a different form of religion. What about Premier League football as a religion?
What kind of football?
Premier League
Oh,
football,
Premier
which
League.
has
Right,
got
okay.
a great following.
Yes, yes. No, well, you know, we do many things which function in that sort of way and have many of the same components. So singing and a communal story, and often a story of triumph over adversity, and so on and so forth. Clearly, it usually lacks the religious component in terms of let's say prayers and communion or whatever particular rituals might be there, but nonetheless, you know, those kind of activities have many of those same things, and I think that's just part and parcel of the generic community bonding exercises you see in all small-scale societies. They're often associated with rituals of marriage or rituals of puberty, but again, all involve singing and feasting and telling of tales of the old times and who we are and where we came from, kind of thing. So yes, it creates a community, but I think what I was trying to point out with our analyses of the American 19th century utopian communes in particular was there's an added benefit that comes from having a religious component to it. Why that works that way, we're not quite sure. I mean, one argument is it introduces a moral high God who's watching over you and can see what you do on Saturday night behind the bushes when nobody else can see what you're up to, as it were, and that imposes a moral safeguard, if you like. I'm not so convinced of that. I mean, I don't doubt that, you know, having a moralizing high God who intervenes to keep everybody on the straight and narrow does work and has a benefit, but I'm not sure that really is the whole story. I keep coming back to the fact that really what makes religions tick is this kind of emotional, transcendental component that comes essentially out of trance one way or another.
I mean, maybe sort of aside to that is that for some people, science has almost become a rather disappointing form of religion. It's the belief system, but it doesn't meet the emotional needs of a belief system. Do you comment on that?
I know where that's coming from. I'm not entirely sure it's true. Science is very exciting.
Oh, I agree with that, but does it have the same emotional community feel to it?
I think so. Actually, you get exactly, if you look at the structure of sciences, they all have these disciplinary structures with about 150 people, somewhere between 100 and 200 people who know each other personally, and they function as a community. And it's you know, that's the only reason people go to conferences, is not to listen to other people's talks, which most people don't. It's to have a beer with people they've collaborated with over the past. So, but I mean, it's a different kind of thing, and I suppose you might argue it's more akin to the kind of hunter-gatherer situation where you don't necessarily have any gods at all. So a number of the hunter-gatherers societies have no concept of there being any kinds of gods or even, you know, a heaven. There are experiences you have which are kind of transcendental in trance states, but you don't need, if you like, for that to work, that component to work, it seems you don't need to have any kind of formal sense of God or gods to make it function. It probably, I agree that science is never going to quite work as well as the religion in this respect to the bonding agency. And I think the parallel to that is the environmental movement, you know, which has all the main similar trappings of religion. But, you know, at the end of the day, most of these communities that are set up, you know, return to nature and stuff like that and save the planet, you know, they just don't last very long. They're much more, in terms of their survival, they're much more like the secular communities in the American Midwest. 15, 20 years, and then, you know, they're gone. They usually hinge around a particular person who's very charismatic And when that person dies, the whole thing falls apart because there are leadership contenders who can't agree. There's no central beliefs really that keep it going.
Here's a rather different question. So Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, most people who read that understand the way in which he quotes your work to conclude, well, therefore religion is obviously false or fake. Do you think your work has any bearing on that question of whether there are gods or whether there is a transcendent realm?
My view has always been that it doesn't actually, nothing I do have done really speaks to that question. And I'm merely offering an explanation of how it works and what its history has been, as it were. And so it's entirely a matter of your individual belief and choice as to what you think at that point. I have my belief, but I don't know that that is a consequence of anything that I've said in terms of the way religions work. But you might reasonably argue that if it's just there as a bonding process, and yes, maybe it doesn't need the religious component. I'm not sure I agree with that entirely, in the sense that what seems to be very important to the effectiveness of these as a mechanism for bonding is this belief in a, if you like, a transcendental world in some form. That seems to be important. Now, whether that's just something that's going on inside your head when you're in a trance state, or whether that has some reality, we can't say.
There's also a question then about what initiates these bondings and the religion. What's the starting point for it? So you've treated it as though it's a bottom-up affair, I think.
Yes.
Whereas most modern religions have launched from powerful founders, whether
Yes.
that's Buddha or Moses or Jesus or Muhammad. Is that part of your considerations as to how these things initiate from the powerful individual?
Yes, I mean, at least we've not particularly looked at this as an issue because in the work we've done, we've not had time. But I think one can tell a story which says, look, religion is only possible. And this is another, if I'd had another hour, I could have given you the cognitive parallel to the story. So I was focused on the bonding side, in the community sense, but there's a parallel psychological cognitive component. And that's, I think, very deeply infused with this whole concept of mentalizing. Well, mentalizing, this ability to understand other people's mind states, is something that's peculiar to humans in particular, although primates all show elements of it, and particularly the bigger brain primates. But humans do it on a gigantic scale. Now, if you look at the structure of mentalizing and how it works, then and how that's related to brain size, because we know from our neuroimaging work and from other people's neuroimaging work that there is a very simple linear relationship between the size of your brain as an individual and how many mentalizing levels, so intentionality levels you can, how many other people's mind states you can cope with. That it's just the size of the computer you can bring to bear on the problem. Then the only people who actually have that as a species are modern humans, and the limits of modern humans' mentalizing capacities appear to be minimally necessary for fully developed religion as we have it. You can have a kind of personalized religion one stage down, which would be fourth order intentionality, which is what the Neanderthals and the archaics would have achieved. So they probably did have some form of religion, but it's not religion as we know it any more than their language would have been language as we know it, because again, mentalizing underpins your language competences. So if you want to know when religion evolved, I'm putting my money very firmly on the appearance of modern humans as the only species that had big enough brains to manage this as a communal sense, religion as a communal activity, where I can explain to you what's going on when you have these particular experiences, or why we're doing these particular rituals, and you will believe what I say. We will agree about that. So bottom up, this was only possible. It's one of those things that became possible in the way that modern languages became possible as brain size increases, and maybe drove brain size in order to allow larger communities to be bonded. But that's separate from the axial age problem, which is the origin of all the modern world religions, Buddhism, Christianity, etc., 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 which is just built around charismatic individuals in every single case. And although none of these hunter-gatherer, trance-based shamanic type religions really have charismatic individuals in that sense, nonetheless, they do quite quickly acquire specialists in the form of shamans who are better than others at doing this kind of stuff. And I think once you've got somebody like that, then there's a lot of evidence pointing at the fact that, and particularly once it becomes locked in with faith, with healing in the medical sense, and faith healing, I suppose you might say, then it very quickly builds up reputations for some individuals as the founts of wisdom, if you like, and they gather disciples and acolytes around them, which is the sort of starting point for development, I think, both is the minimal starting point for the development of larger scale doctrinal religions.
Thank you. Our time is nearly up, and there's lots more questions that are in the chat, so I apologize for those that we haven't had a chance to ask you a question. I'll just take one more general one at the end, which is, what do you think will be the effect of falling a religious affiliation in the West?
Well, you might argue that religion as a communal bonding device is being replaced by political positions, as it were. And again, I come back to the fact that, you know, the American 19th century experience is there's something odd about religions that work in a way that purely secular ideologies don't. They have a very short lifespan. And I think we've seen that. You know, you could argue that the Nazis were a form of religion. They had all the trappings of religion, you know, songs and philosophies and theologies and goodness knows what, effectively. But it didn't last. And likewise, nor really has communism, and nor really has most of the environmental movements. You know, there's something missing from them that makes religions work. And clearly people keep coming back to those positions. See it historically in the return to religion in Russia after long attempts to suppress it. You see much the same thing in China, despite very long attempts to, equally long attempts to suppress religion. You know, whether you regard it as a good thing or a bad thing, it works.
Thank you. Yes,
it works better.
Yeah, I'd love to follow that up with longer discussion. That would be a marvelous opportunity. But I think our time is up, so I'll have to close things for today. Robin, thank you ever so much for a fascinating seminar. If we were in person, we would give you a round of applause, so we can do that individually within the quiet of our own room. But thank you ever so much for a very fascinating talk. Thank you ever so much.
Pleasure.
And for those watching, the rolling slides will come back on at the end, so you'll be able to have a look at any of the things that you missed that Faraday are doing before we finally close the session. But in closing, thank you again, Robin, for a fascinating seminar. Thank you.